Good morning. I'm Richard Edelman, and I'm here to present the results of the 2025 Edelman Trust Barometer. Before I do, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the prior studies. The last 25 years have seen 6 major events. We started the Trust Barometer because of the battle in Seattle in 1999 when the NGO movement protested globalization at the WTO meeting. It really challenged the premise of the so-called end of history, that capitalism and democracy were going to roll. The second was the war in Iraq in 2003, which destroyed trust in government. The third was the global financial crisis in 2008, when trust in business plunged, especially for the financial sector. The fourth was the rise of populism, 2016, Brexit, Macron, Trump. The fifth was COVID-19, which really destroyed belief in experts and in the science. Last is geopolitical strife. Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, China, the US. We have 6 major findings over the period that we've been doing the Trust Barometer. The first was 2005, the loss of trust in leaders. And you'll note it took 2 years after the Iraq War for that to happen. It's always a delayed reaction. It doesn't happen immediately. The second was the mass class divide, which started in 2012 and resulted eventually in the electoral earthquake in UK, France, and the US. But that mass class divide, the division between the top quartile and bottom quartile as to opinion of institutions. The third was the clear rise of trust in single-party states relative to democracies. That happened in 2014. It's tied to economic growth. It's also a recognition that both government and media are higher in trust in single-party states. Then the battle for truth, probably the central proposition of the Trust Barometer in 2016. There are no agreed facts. First was that media went to its various corners, but now we're at a place where it's very difficult to get agreed facts at all because of misinformation. 2021, business became the most trusted institution. It had been NGOs for 19 years. Business became most trusted because it's the only institution both ethical and competent. Business had a very good COVID-19, but continued to rise in the ranks on ethics. 2 by 2, it's the only one in the top right corner. Last, trust moved local. Historically, trust was conveyed top-down, the Moses model. Then it went peer-to-peer in about 2006 because we lost trust in leaders. In the last 4 years, because of COVID, trust has gone local. In my employer, my CEO, and even my company newsletter. So, let's get to 2025. What we observed this year is a progression from fears to polarization and now to grievance. So, this is a move from acceptance to active, from a rejection of the status quo. So, as to fears, what were the fears? Globalization, downward economic and social mobility, lack of quality information, starting in about 2015. Polarization came 2017, 2018. Basically, ideology becomes identity. Also, a strong sense that we're sick of being talked down to. I demand dignity. The preconditions for grievance are as follows. First, lack of belief in a better future. Only 30% of those we studied across 28 countries, 33,000 people, only 30% believed that their families will be better off in the next generation. Not a single Western democracy over 30%. France, Japan, 10%. The mass class divide that I identified is now transversal. It used to be US, UK, and France. It's now in 3/4 of the countries. It's highest in Thailand and Saudi Arabia. There's an utter lack of belief in leaders. This is a very important message for Davos. 2/3 today believe that business, government, and media leaders lie to us for their own ends. Finally, there are no agreed facts. 2/3 say, I cannot rely on news. I can't differentiate between disinformation and news. The descent into grievance is profound. There is now aggressive advocacy for self-interest. Why? Because I have a zero-sum mentality. I have to get my last slice of pizza in the fraternity. 61% of people now have grievance against business, government, and the wealthy. Of that 61, 20% is highly aggrieved, 40% moderately aggrieved. 3/4 say it's hard to pay my bills. 2/3 say I am discriminated against. The most shocking statistic, 50% of whites in the United States believe they are discriminated against. Broad-based grievance has consequences. But just to understand, grievance is universal. It is across gender, it is across income, age groups, and race. It is a universal factor in our society. It has to do partly with deep suspicion of the wealthy. This is another important message for Davos. Over half of our respondents now say capitalism does not work, that the political system is broken, which, by the way, is why, when there are elections, traditionally, you would see trust in government go up after the election. Now, it goes down. Why? Because the losers say the system doesn't work. I don't accept the results of the elections. The winners have a slight bump. These guys have a big drop. In fact, only 45% trust those who have different political views. Stunning. Also, this is the scariest statistic of all. 40% of our respondents believe in hostile activism as a means of curing grievance. Literally, 20% endorse violence as a means of an end. And it's 53% of 18 to 35s. Pay attention. I'm telling you something important. This is a game change. This is not business as usual. This is a highly aggrieved world, and it's global. Okay, the effects of high grievance are as follows. All institutions move to a level of distrust. Business was trusted, it was the universal. Business has a huge drop among the highly aggrieved. CEO trust is cut in half from 64 to 30%. Business drops 30% among the highly aggrieved. There's huge suspicion of innovation. This is important for all who are pushing for AI. Only 30% trust use of AI by business among the highly aggrieved. Also, people fear falling victim to discrimination. It's again across gender, age, race, income. It's a universal sense that I am getting screwed. The role of business in a time of grievance. In the last few years, the default mechanism has been, we have a societal issue that needs fixing. Business is going to do it because it's, again, the one that can do it because it's both competent and ethical. That's not the condition today. What we see is it cannot any longer be the default solution on societal issues. Business leaders lack the belief and they lack the authority because of a huge drop in perceived ethics among the highly aggrieved, to do with inflation, to do with pay, to do with frustration about AI. In their minds, it's the same thing as globalization. PTSD on 25 years ago. It's going to be the same story. So therefore, there are new yellow lines for business. I want to underline this for all of you trying to advise CEOs. If you can make an impact and your actions bring profit, we welcome business to the problem. However, if you are meddling in that which should be government, don't do it. What do the highly aggrieved want from business? Let's start at the top. We want good paying jobs. I want Tak to talk about this in Japan. He's got an effort on this. 85%. We want to be re-skilled. We do not want to fall behind. It is your job to make us competitive. We want affordable products. We're sick of inflation. We can't continue to pay as much as we have. And climate change, 63%. There are absolutely essential roles for the other institutions. This is not a business-only game. It is only going to work if the other three institutions come up to snuff. Specifically, for the first time in 5 years, I can report that there's a big role for NGOs. In the prior period, NGOs have been crowded out. They've been crowded out by business taking on societal issues or by criticism from certain parties in politics. And NGOs have put their heads down. That time is over. NGOs need to stand up and lead. Specifically, they are a unifying force that brings us together. They're local and they're credible. The highly aggrieved want to follow NGOs. Media. Media's got to put facts first, avoid ideology, and stop chasing clicks. When 2/3 of people say, I can't get good quality information, we have a problem. By the way, I don't think that media can do it alone because it's seen as polarizing. So other institutions will have to put good quality information into the bloodstream. Last and perhaps most important, government. Government has to deliver results that benefit ordinary citizens. It needs to be seen as benefiting me, not society writ large. Get competent, get things done. If President Trump can do this, he will begin the game change. And there are half a dozen other governments that are new that have this opportunity to deliver. I want to give you a sense of what's possible. I want to contrast two countries, Singapore and Germany. Both democracies, both, big players in the world. Germany has 69% grievance, 41% trust. Singapore has 39% grievance, 65% trust. If German trust in institutions can rise to the level of Singapore, then we get to the place of economic optimism and possibility. We see a doubling in economic optimism if there's trust in institutions. So trust becomes the key to the castle, to unlock hope. So my conclusions on the Trust Barometer 2025 are as follows. First, this is about facts, it's about dignity, and it's about income. Simple words, important thoughts. Second, grievance makes society dysfunctional. It blocks innovation, it causes conflict, it makes government and business unable to work together, and it creates a complete social dysfunction. We cannot have what we had in New York in December, the shooting. This is completely intolerable as a matter of a civil society. Next point, business has the license to act where it has the possibility to make a profit and to make a difference. Finally, the other institutions have to step up. AI is the litmus test. Can the institutions work well together? Can we resolve this big fear about losing jobs? And trust is absolutely the key to reversal of grievance. So I want to have 4 specific proposals. I don't do this normally, but I have 4 specific ideas that I want to at least throw to the panel. I think we have to have a reckoning on COVID-19. If we do not have agreed facts on what happened in that 3-year period, we will never get, again, to a reliance on science, a belief in experts, or a functioning institutional society. Second, I want there to be a multi-institution commitment to reskilling. We cannot leave people behind. Brad Smith had a really brilliant essay 2 weeks ago in which he outlined a format for that. Third, every institution's role is to combat misinformation. It is not the media alone. We have to get to agreed facts. You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts, according to Senator Moynihan, one of my heroes. Last, trust is local. We have to utilize local sources of trust, whether NGOs, pastors, teachers, towards an end of optimism. We've got to get the world to feel that yes, we can. Thank you very much. Alyson, to you.
Well, I feel like it should have been a conversation over drinks, maybe. This is very sobering and really pretty jarring. So thank you, Richard, for doing this study. I'm Alyson Shontell. I'm the Editor-in-Chief and Chief Content Officer of Fortune, and I want to introduce you to our esteemed panelists, from which you will get great advice across the board. We have Brad Smith here. He's the president of Microsoft. He's been there for 31 years. He's seen a lot, and their company is investing $80 billion just this year on AI infrastructure. Nikki Haley, presidential candidate for the Republican Party, former governor of South Carolina. She's a member of the Edelman Government and Public Affairs chair. And she's also the former ambassador to the UN. Next to her, we have Takeshi Niinami. He's the president and CEO of Suntory, the largest Japanese whiskey brand there is, and the maker of Jim Beam for you Americans. He's been the CEO for a decade, and he's been an economic advisor to the 4 different PMs of Japan. Then we have Gillian Tett, who's been in my chair before. She's incredible for the FT. She sits on their editorial board, so a great media mind. She's also a provost at King's College, so sees a lot in the world of education. And then finally, we have Dolf van de Brink, who's the CEO and chairman of Heineken. He has been the CEO of various locations of Heineken for the last decade or so. So very well versed and world traveled. So a great group. But first, I want to talk about the fact that out of last year, there were more than 60 elections that happened worldwide, and in nearly all of them, the incumbents lost. One of the winners, Mr. Donald Trump, was just inaugurated in the United States yesterday. So Nikki, I wanted to toss to you, because you've been on the campaign trail, you've seen the world for the last 2 years. I'm curious, first off, what do you make of Trump's next presidency? How do you navigate that for the leaders in the room as it pertains to the trust? And also, are you surprised by what you are hearing in these results based on what you've seen?
Well, I think, first of all, good morning. It's early and you all look awake, so it's good to be with you. You know, I'll say the biggest thing is I looked at Edelman's Trust Barometer, and it was so spot on. After campaigning for the last 2 years, there is no better word to describe what people are feeling than grievance. You know, you go out there and you'd see your average American working hard, trying to raise their family. They would go to the grocery store, and what they would see is they were spending a lot more, but they were getting a lot less. They would go to work, and what they found at work was all of a sudden, in work and in life, they were a label. They were black, white, or brown. They were man or woman. They were straight or gay. They were Republican or Democrat. Everybody was given a label. And on top of that, they felt like people were getting ahead because of their label off of their backs. So they would go and they were spending more money, and then they saw illegal immigration coming through, and they're looking at their taxes go up because illegal immigrants were going into schools and hospitals and getting government assistance. You put all of that together, and then their power bill was going up, and then the pressures got higher. And then when they listened to media, they listened to a lot of opinions. The facts were out the window. Everybody was going for their section of the pie. So Fox was going for their 25%. MSNBC was going for their 25%. CNN for theirs. Everybody was going, but no one was just putting the facts out there. And so it built up to a lot of grievance. And basically what you saw is with all of this, everybody said, we have to have something different. We can't take it anymore. And so the anti-incumbency across the world has happened. You know, Richard, I saw everybody kind of take a gasp when Richard said 50% of whites feel discriminated against. Well, at first blush, you might think, how is that possible? Well, think about in a company, white males see that you've got DEI, they're seeing minorities promoted, they're seeing females promoted, they're seeing different offerings for others, and they're doing just as hard a work and working just as much, making the same results, yet they're being told they're not getting promoted. They're not getting these things. So the grievance really built up in white males. In terms of President Trump, what can you expect? He's coming in and his focuses are on what the grievances were. The economy, illegal immigration, and to deal with the economy, building up energy, and making sure that they build up technology in the process. Those are his 4 focuses. And the difference is, you know, we can all rest assured, we know how this is going to go. You know, in 2017, no one knew what to expect. Now everyone knows how he acts. Different issues, same thing. But the difference is he knows 4 years goes by very fast. And he knows he may only have 2 years because there could be a congressional turnover. That's why you're seeing the 200 executive orders. That's why you're seeing the cabinet approved very quickly. That's why all of that's going to move fast. And so I think you can very much expect the focus on economy, U.S. investment, making sure companies are no unfair trade imbalances, making sure there's no monetary corruption along the way, focused very much on pulling back all regulations, pulling back all mandates on electric vehicles, all mandates on anything green, drilling, fracking, anything that will boost the energy sector, anything that will boost the technology sector. Very telling, if you looked at the inauguration yesterday, you saw every one of the tech moguls sitting in front of the cabinet. Not behind the cabinet, in front of the cabinet. They have his ear. They're going to focus on that. That's good for AI. That's good for technology. I would say while people are nervous and anxious, instead, when you look at the U.S., it is about to be a huge economic boom. You're going to be, looking at lots of investment, more M&A, strengthen the economy, more investment, and a lot of pullback on regulation. So a good time for businesses to move forward. Finally, I'll say every business you are starting to see are pulling back from DEI, and I welcome that. I think it's really important. What we're seeing in America, everybody just wants to be Americans. They don't want to be a label anymore. They don't feel like they can take it anymore. So they want to be a part of something great. They want companies to tell them what the problems are and allow them to be part of the solutions. They want companies to be very transparent, and they want you to over-communicate. Because when you over-communicate, that builds trust with the employee and with the consumer. But overall, it's great to be here. I will tell you to lean in, be flexible, be transparent. It's not all doom and gloom. I actually think that our best days are still ahead.
So I want to move to other parts of the world as well, because we have a global leadership audience here. So Suntory is based in Japan, and now you've overseen economic advice for 4 different prime ministers. And then we have Dolf, and Heineken is based in the Netherlands. I have to say, your countries are rather low on the positivity. So 4 out of 5 people in your areas of the world felt that the next generation would be worse off than today's generation. So I'm curious from your points of view as company leaders, as economic advisors, why is that? What was this surprising, and what do you see?
Well, thank you for inviting me to this great panel. First, Japan lost 30 years, and during the 30 years, we've been going through deflation. During the deflation, I think corporates, business, governments, and local governments I'm talking about, we've been creating the distrust from the people. First and foremost, wage hasn't risen for 30 years. And business increased the dividends, buyback, and lower the ratio of the labor against the profits. So we totally lost the trust from people. The government didn't support the people to be able to get the higher wages. So first, economic issue. 2, the things are changing, such as declining population, decline of the working population, and the silver democracy is around. The people in, let's say, 60s, 70s, they've got a lot of social benefits. But what about the younger generation? They lost lots of, opportunities. So, and the things are changing like technology, but we didn't give, business didn't give the upskill, retraining to people. So people are left behind. So I have to talk about the 2 things. One, we have to change the entire norm of the wage increase instead of increasing dividends, giving the repurchase, and the corporates have to work together. That's underway. Second, we have to change the total social package to be more kind to the younger generation. So I'm so stunned that we got the 10% of the satisfaction. But despite the fact that Japan, have lots of cash, lots of assets. But one thing is, 4 prime ministers didn't listen to me. The reason is they care about the short-term results to gain votes, but it doesn't resolve the long-term problems, social issues. So key thing is that we are working together with the government now, working together with the even labor union, so that we can increase the wages above the CPI, and we can provide the upskill, we can provide retraining. And another last factor, life expectancy is longer and longer. After retirement, people have at least 10, 15 years. they are so worried about after retirement. So reskilling is so important for us in our society. Thank you.
Dolf, I wanted to bring you in. What are you seeing in the Netherlands?
Yeah, thanks, Alyson. And I agree with your earlier comment, listening to Richard. I need a beer. It's a bit early, so we'll postpone that.
This is basically a beer party. Both
Exactly.
the entire corporate world is represented by a bar.
Exactly. Well, that would bring people together, and I think that's something we need more of rather than less of. But no, but it's very sobering. And listening to Richard and the timeline, this has been a long time coming, and it feels to me personally also like a final wake-up call that we better start addressing this systemically, otherwise it really gets, even darker than it already is starting to get to. When such a large portion of society is anxious, feels disempowered, and is pessimistic about the future, that's very dangerous. And so the most important word that comes to mind is hope. Somehow we need to restore hope that the future can be better. And as business, we have a huge role to play. Our role is to bring economic optimism back. And that starts by re-engaging with society. Looking back, it feels like during the era of globalization that business withdraw into doing business and left the rest to government and vice versa. It didn't used to be like that. I remember the late 1980s, early 1990s, a lot of Dutch European business leaders participated in the public debate around the unification of Europe, the euro currency, etc. But then for 20 years that didn't happen. So I agree with Nikki. We need to speak up. We need to re-engage. We need to communicate, not just internally with our people, but with society. And it feels awkward because it has not happened for a long time. And initially, audiences won't be that receptive, but we need to re-find our voice. And myself, together with some other Dutch leaders, we're at least try to do that in our own community. We need to make the case for capitalism. One of the things, Richard, in your report is that I believe more than half the people don't believe capitalism is a good thing anymore. Well, I hope I can say with this audience that we don't know a better system. So this is the system that we need to make work. And we need to show that it can bring prosperity for the masses, that it will address the environmental side effects, that it can be fair. And how do we do it? By being a role model, by walking the talk, by investing in future growth, but also investing in decarbonizing our business, investing in our people, investing in fair wages. And the topic that Tak touched on in the end, this whole topic of rescaling is going to be incredibly important. If our economies can't provide meaningful, well-paying middle-class jobs, then the bottom will fall out. And those middle-class jobs have come under tremendous pressure over the last 2-3 decades. And we need to restore that. We need to find a way of creating those jobs and start by building competence, reskilling our people. And we also can't do it as business alone. This is the area where business and society need to work together.
Gillian, I wanted to bring you into the conversation. You have a really good vantage point of what's happening in education. There's a lack of trust in our teachers, in our curriculums, in higher education in particular, but also in media, in your seat at the FT. There's many challenges for us in the media world. And I think in terms of the survey, we're almost the scum of the trust factor. Now everybody doesn't trust anybody anymore, not even their own CEOs, but they certainly have lost a lot of trust. Trust in media has just been going down and down and down. And I have to admit, I'm concerned about what AI will do to that mix of trust in media and the ever proliferation of misinformation. So I'm wondering from your vantage point, particularly with your FT hat on now, how are you thinking about rebuilding trust in media?
Well, I have to say, I think a lot of business leaders would regard the findings for media right now as a form of divine justice, because for years journalists were throwing brickbats at business leaders, and now it's, now we're on the same level. I have 2 quick points to make, which are basically drawing on my sort of the fact I'm both with the Financial Times writing columns, but I'm also leading King's College in Cambridge. The first point is around science and innovation, and I want to pick up on what Richard said about COVID. Some of you may have seen an op-ed that the FT ran recently from Peter Thiel, one of the very few times that Peter Thiel has put his head above the parapet recently. And in it, he basically argued that we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in order to move forward after COVID in America. It was one of our most read pieces on the FT, and I think a lot of people found that very shocking. However, and certainly I was very concerned sitting in a university that this is fueling an anti-science mentality right now, which is very strong. However, there's a way to flip that round and uphold the principles of science, which every university would want to do, and say that one of the things that's really been missing in the last few years from our leaders is a recognition of a concept that's common in science called the error bar. And those who are scientists and have scientific training will know that one of the things you do when you publish results as a scientist is indicate your level of confidence in those results. And I'd argue one of the biggest things that went wrong in COVID was that for entirely understandable reasons, leaders had to make definitive statements on the basis of impartial information. And when some of that was later found out to be very incomplete, not impartial, incomplete information, when that information was later found out to be very incomplete, there wasn't a recognition that, guess what, that's the nature of science. So if we're going to rebuild faith in science and expertise, we have to rediscover that core scientific principle of the error bar and be honest about what we don't know and what we do know and our level of confidence. The second point I'd like to make is about Gen Z, because sitting in a university, I see these Gen Z creatures every single day. And I don't think there's any Gen Z represented in the room. If there are, wave your hand. We will recognize you as a lonely member of that tribe in Davos. But I want to quickly flip this around for a moment and say we've heard a lot about what we don't trust in institutions. We've not heard a lot about what we do trust. And I would argue on a practical basis, everyday basis, there's one thing that Gen Z does trust, which is its own tribe and its peer group online. And in many ways, that's an extrapolation from what Richard was talking about in the evolution of trust towards peer-to-peer and local. And I've been doing a lot of brainstorming recently with Jigsaw, which is part of Google Alphabet, that's been using anthropologists to look at what Gen Z does or does not trust. I'm trained originally as a cultural anthropologist, so that's my own academic background. And to cite one tiny example, a big ethnographic survey of Gen Z in India and America showed that Gen Z trust bots more than human doctors for medical advice.
Wow.
That might look shocking, and in some ways it is, and if you're a doctor, it's doubly shocking. However, it's not that surprising when you think that Gen Z has stopped trusting institutional leaders. They are, though, trusting their peer group, and what anthropologists would call lateral trust. Eyeball trust has been extrapolated to the online crowd, in my view. And in some ways, they're looking at bots as an extension of that peer-to-peer trust. Again, that might sound odd for our generation who grew up thinking about AI as being like HAL in 2001 AD, where AI was something done to us from on top. For the Gen Z generation, AI is something that happens at the tip of your fingers in your phone, and in many ways it's part of your localized peer group. It's a very different way of thinking about it. But the key point is this: alongside all this evidence about what we don't trust, alongside all of these polling showing that we don't believe in AI, there's great concern about innovation, on a practical, day-to-day lived basis, which is what anthropologists study, what we actually do, not what we say we do, on a lived basis, we are actually trusting this all the time, including with AI. So I think the real question for leaders is how do we combine those two contradictory paradoxes, if you like, and actually turn it into a more positive outcome that glues us together.
So interesting, because you've got the demand for facts, and then you have a younger generation who trust their peers and the influencer generation rising, which don't always go together. So Brad, AI is central to all of these conversations. I'd say you're the foremost expert in the world on this topic over at Microsoft. You've said that AI is like electricity, and that what happens in the next 4 years will determine the economic output for the next quarter century. So I'm curious, why do you think it's like electricity? What do we need to know about AI? And what is it going to do to an already skeptical audience of people watching this technology maybe a little bit wary?
I think I'd start by building on what people have said and put technology in the context of everything else. And yeah, I think Richard captured really well just the series of shocks that people have had to live with since the start of this century. I actually think that if you put all of the factors in COVID together, and you look, say, across the G7 or especially the developed world, in a sense, it's almost taken 5 years to run its course. And by that I mean there was a pandemic, and the strategy that almost all the developed country governments pursued was the same: lock down the economy and increase spending so as to avoid a deep recession, which they largely did. But that unleashed inflation, which needed to be addressed by increasing interest rates. And so what that meant for people, as Nikki captured, was you went to the grocery store and paid more for eggs, and if you borrowed money to pay for anything, your borrowing costs went up as well. So it's been a really tough 5 years. A lot of that you can look at and say is cyclical, and if I try to be optimistic, we're probably coming out of that, with inflation having come down and interest rates having come down. Now, as we look to the future, I do think we have some long-term structural challenges. And the number one long-term structural challenge in the industrial world is demographics. That jumps off the page. So much of the world is going to be Japan and what Japan has lived through for the last quarter of a century. And if you look at Germany, you look at Italy, these are countries where the working age population over the course of 25 years is contracting sharply by as much as 40%. But people are living longer, so a smaller number of working people are going to need to generate the GDP to provide the support that the elderly are going to require. That is going to be an enormous challenge. And I think the Gen Z population is starting to figure that out. How do we deal with that? This is, I think, an important dimension for technology. There are certain technologies, like electricity, that really become a general purpose technology. They transform every part of the economy, which means they unleash productivity growth much more than typical technologies, but they also unleash much more transformative change. Now, you can look at the upside and you can look at the downside. The industrial countries of the world in particular are going to be in desperate need of productivity growth. And AI offers, I would argue, quite possibly the biggest source of productivity growth since the world did start to experience, say, in the 1890s, as electricity started to spread across many economies. But the downside is if the impact is uneven. I think an underlying factor for the last 35 years has been digitization, computerization, and economically, it's been demonstrated to, frankly, have automated low-paying jobs for people with less education, much more than high-paying jobs, and frankly, unleashed societal factors, that have caused people to spend more time oftentimes with their phones than their families. And so we've got to come to terms with all of these technological factors. There is real upside, but if we don't get skilling right, if we don't think through the sociology of all of this, it, I think, risks undermining people's trust even more in almost everything except themselves.
What's needed between government and business to make sure that AI is built the right way, that we create innovation, but we don't also create a ton of job loss? I mean, I think everyone is looking at this technology coming saying, wow, my company plans to replace me as soon as they possibly can with this technology that's coming. And when we're hearing the stats about wage concern, about job mobility concerns, it creates tension, frankly. So what's needed? Nikki, I'm curious for your vantage point as well. How do you, and I know you've spent some time with Trump and Vance in recent weeks. How do you feel like government is ready to take this on?
Well, I think government needs to do two things together with the business community and NGOs, because it's three legs of this stool. The first is some consensus on what you consider to be the security and safety of AI. I don't think people are prepared to look at the luminaries and say, oh, I'm going to put all my faith in them as they invent this thing. There's this massive race of people with great ability, but also ambition. And I think in order for this to serve the public and serve it effectively, it does require a more common international approach. We saw some of that emerge over the last 12 or 18 months, especially through the G7. And with all of the change in the G7, I hope we can keep that together. The second thing is skilling. If you look, and this data is more about the US, but I think it's generalizable to most of, say, the G7. From 1980 to 2000, employer investments in employee skilling increased. And most of it was because PCs were going into the workplace and people didn't know how to use them. So employers spent the money to train their employees. But by the year 2000, people had figured out that people were showing up and they sort of knew how to use this stuff. And so you've seen for 25 years now, employer investments in training stagnate and then decline. And we're going to need to invest anew. And employers can do a huge amount for their people by embracing that. I think in the tech sector, we have a lot we can and are seeking to do, but we need governments and NGOs to deliver skilling at scale. And I think we're going to need government efforts to really encourage this. And I think NGOs play this critical role in really filling in a lot of societal gaps.
Nikki?
I think first of all, it's a good thing that, tech CEOs are getting involved with government, because they are the best to tell government what to do, how to do it. Government, I've always believed, breaks more than it fixes. The private sector has a better way of doing things, and I think it's good that that's happening. But you've got a fear there, right? A fear overall globally of, but what if AI gets out of control? I don't think governments need to heavily regulate this, because this could really open up innovation. It could open up science. It could open up education. We need to lean in. But I do think governments, the best way to alleviate the fear is put some laws in place that are basic, that will make the overall public feel better. So for example, you can't use AI to take on someone's identity. You can't use AI in the health sphere that's going to cause bodily harm. You can't use AI militarily without a person actually approving an action being taken. You can't use AI to in any way change election results. If you put certain things in place that are basic, one that gives the public confidence, it's uniform across the world, not just per country, and then you're allowing innovators to innovate. The second part of alleviating fear is communicate to everyone how AI can make your life better. We actually need you to do this job, so AI is going to take all of these other things that are taking up your time and they're going to make it better. Explain to employees how AI could make their life better. But also figure out, we look as a business, you look at the future of profits. You look at what your 5-year plan is. You talk about all these things. Tell your employees what the 5-year plan is with AI. What does that mean for their jobs? The lack of communication around AI. Keep in mind, most of the public doesn't even know what AI is. They couldn't say it in a sentence or two what it is. All they know is that all of a sudden there's going to be, in their minds, robots everywhere and people aren't going to have jobs. And until the companies go and start to clarify what that is, and until governments go and put the protections in place, there will be a fear that I think almost makes people paralyzed as opposed to going forward.
So I want to switch topics a little bit, because I think we can all agree that the scariest stat that we all saw in this Trust Barometer report was the fact that 40% approve of hostile activism. Now that could just be a really angry tweet. X, what do you call it on X these days? Tweet, I still call it tweet. Or it could be, the worst case scenario, what we saw in New York with the United Healthcare CEO. We've written at Fortune a lot about how people are opting out of the CEO job. It's just not worth it sometimes. The risk is too high. You're blamed for everything. You're perceived as wealthy and not solving problems. So why take the job? I'm curious, as you all read that hostility stat in your positions of leadership, how do you take that as a CEO? And I mean, Nikki, as a politician, we just saw President Trump have multiple assassination attempts on his life. Is it worth it?
Well, I think, again, business has been in distrust since the Lehman shock, I believe. And we haven't given a solution to society. And our target should not be the increased value in the short term. Definitely a value should be created to become indispensable in society. And the word indispensable is that we have to be appreciated by society, providing the investment to people, and providing solution to the communities. And so business in Japan now is working together to work with the NPOs and NGOs to resolve the issues. And our problem is the vicious cycle of poverty. And the parents with no, least education, they don't give the opportunities to education to their children. And that comes around the worst society. So business has to play a key role to resolve those issues, not relying on the government, because the government doesn't function to go into the social issues, which are in local, very much local. So how we can become the indispensable is we businesses have to work with the local NPOs and NGOs to resolve the issues. And we can be dispensable, then our risk premium goes down. So we have to think about what to do with the new capitalism. What is the best capitalism for us to be indispensable? And the current greedy capitalism should be replaced by the commons capitalism. Now we've been talking about the new capitalism for long, but we have to take action toward the new capitalism, which is based on the goal for a business to become indispensable, supported by society. So that's what we Japan have to, pursue, working with the civil society, Gen Zs, because the Gen Zs come join us because we have such a purpose in doing that. So to become innovative, we have to recruit the good, talented people who believe the purpose is aligned with the, becoming the indispensable and appreciated by society. I think now is the time. Business has to take action to push the government. Business is the most important to become a spearhead for that direction.
Gillian, did I see you lifting a finger?
Yeah, I was going to say one very quick thing to build on what Niinami-san said. To cite another quick example of the anthropology research into trust, which Jigsaw, and I see that Yasmin Green and the head of Jigsaw is over there, so grab her if you want to know more, found is that when they asked Gen Z how they read newspapers, this is the anthropologists, they realize, or rather media groups, they realize that what Gen Z is doing is they read the headlines first, then they read the comments, and only after that do they actually read the content. And that will horrify, as I say, everyone who's not Gen Z, which is almost all of us in the room. But what's going on is essentially Gen Z's looking to their peer group, online usually, but not always, for validation about what is or is not true. And there are two options, or two ways to respond to that. You can either say, that is ridiculous, I, as this important leader, should have the right to tell everyone else what to do, they should listen to me and trust me, and if they don't, that's appalling. Or you can simply accept reality and say, this is how social interaction has shifted, and we're going to have to work with that. So I'm simply going to add to what Niinami-san said, and said, I think the secret of business and politics, or any leaders, including university leaders, is to recognize that you're dealing with a group that wants validation through the online tribe, and you need to start working with, not against, lateral patterns of trust.
And Dolf, I know you're a proponent of stakeholder capitalism, and you've talked about how it's just not all about maximizing profit. I'm curious how you view the CEO role as evolving. You've been a CEO for a number of years, and I'm curious, with this context, is business still the best solution? How do we fix what's been broken in capitalism to make it better?
Yeah. Heineken is still a family-controlled business, 160 years, fifth generation of the family is involved. And I think, therefore, we have a slightly longer-term perspective, thinking in generations. So we always had this sensibility. But to build on what Tak and Brett were saying, I do believe there's already a shift happening in the relationship between labor and companies. And when you look back the last 20, 30 years, actually, with the accession of China and Eastern Europe to the World Trade Organization, there was a huge influx of labor into the global labor pool, which actually was deflationary on global labor. And one of the systemic causes why salaries have been held back for 20, 25 years, that is changing. We are going from an era of abundance to an era of scarcity, as was commented on. Already in the Netherlands, you start seeing that happening, and it is having an impact on salaries. We see the salaries in our collective labor agreements now going up faster than executive pay. And I think it's only the beginning as we start seeing this relationship shifting. On the notion of AI, indeed, how do we make sure it augments human skills rather than replace? And I think applying this bottom-up is incredibly important, and at least the probably imperfect way, but the way we try to go about it in our company is to really make this available to as many people possible, even if we don't know how it will be used. So we have a first wave of 10,000 people who have access now to dedicated AI tools to help them, to support them, to facilitate them, to get rid of a lot of meaningful tasks so that they can lean into the more meaningful stuff.
And Brad, I'm curious, tech is usually such an optimistic industry. You're paving the way for the future. Do you think that tech can solve some of these problems? I mean, I admit I would rather have AI tell me if something's misinformation than looking at comments from Gen Z on Instagram posts. Is there a solution there for tech that we could look forward to?
Well, I think technology will help solve many problems. I'm very optimistic about that. And I also think that technology has created many of the challenges that have shaped everything that we're talking about here. I think that, to me, the one thing that is most generalizable across every one of us is to start by trying to understand better why different people feel the way they do. Everybody feels aggrieved, but the thing I find fascinating in talking to different groups is they feel aggrieved in different ways and for different things. And when you listen to them, you learn that their grievances are rooted in reality. It's not just real to them. The problems they're dealing with are real. And I think the next thing that leaders need to do is actually acknowledge the problem. I think one can move too fast to say, I have an answer for that. People need to feel heard, they need to be understood, and they need leaders of institutions to acknowledge what we might have done that helped contribute to the problems that bother them. And then I think ultimately the key to rebuilding trust is frankly maybe to talk a little bit less, do a little bit more, and perhaps most importantly, under-promise and over-deliver. Over-promising and under-delivering is not going to be a solution. And so it's going to take time, I think, if there's any hope of turning this around.
I think those are incredible words to end on. Great advice for all in the room. Richard's going to come up for some final remarks. Thank you all so much.
So you've heard an hour of this, and I want to give you 2 or 3 things to take away. The first is, think of this as a political campaign for institutions. Think of this as we need to take the people who are in high grievance and move them back to moderate. because moderate grievance people still have high trust in institutions, relatively. And we need to assuage the highly aggrieved by listening to them, by, as Brad said, doing more than we promise, and making sure that they feel part of the system and that the system actually can work. The second thing that I want to say is media can't get to a place of enough power of facts alone, because media has been, in a certain way, based on business models, also based on constant attacks against its veracity. All the other institutions need to step into the information void. That means business, government, and NGOs. Put information into the bloodstream because it's an urgent problem. We've got to get to agreed facts. The last thing I would tell you is, I do feel optimistic, but I only feel optimistic if business doesn't put its head down and wait for grievance to pass. Grievance will not pass. This is not a moment for passivity. This is a moment for acting. Acting intelligently, but do something. Get out of this room and go, what am I going to do? Stand up, square your shoulders, and my old man would say, he was in the Army, square your shoulders, son, and walk into the wind. You've got to do something, each one of you in your own way. You are responsible for fixing grievance. I'm deeply appreciative for your support of the Trust Barometer, and we'll be back next year. Thank you.